Awesome. So as Benji mentioned, we are going to record this session for anybody who misses, or at the end, you're just like, oh, I need to know about that cheddar again. You can find it on YouTube. So if anybody doesn't want to be recorded, go ahead and turn off your camera. But otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're so happy that you're all here. This is a very special tasting. For any of you guys who have been to other ones before, you know they're all very special, but this one is especially special. So we're doing the cheddar tasting. It's the last of our installment in the AGC series, the Alpine Gouda cheddar, this kind of first opportunity for us to deep dive into categories. So tonight we're going into cheddar, one of America's most loved cheeses, and we have a special guest with us, which is Tom Perry from Shelburne Farms. We're so excited to have him. We also have a couple other people, the normal cast of characters, if you will. We have Benji, whose voice you already have heard. Benji's going to, of course, be making sure we don't screw anything up and kind of keep our pacing. And then we're going to have Will in the chat like he always is. And so if you guys have any questions, we have a nice full group today. So we're going to use the chat very diligently. So go ahead and make sure you ask your questions in the chat, and then Benji and Will make sure that they get put up on the screen, and then we ask them. And tonight, kind of always, or like always, we're going to talk about every cheese and wine that you have. But I always encourage people to eat, enjoy things, try the crackers, try the jam. I would always suggest you try the cheeses by themselves when you try them for the first time, but then enjoy things. Don't wait on things. And, I will get carried away at some point talking. I love this stuff and I'll get into it. And so if you just want to try the third cheese, don't let me torture you on the first two. Try the third cheese, but save enough so when we get there, you still have cheese when we're talking about it. Yeah, those are my fine points, my housekeeping. Does anybody have any questions before we launch into it? We're going to talk about the wines first in case anybody wants to open only one bottle, but we're also going to talk about the pairings throughout. So if you want to open both, it's encouraged.
Well, no questions so far, but we do have one person showing love for Shelburne Farms, who got Igawell got their honors thesis in University of Vermont in '94. So Tom, you got some love in here.
Yes, beautiful. So we have some cool wines today. I wanted this to be a fun opportunity to try some new wines, and this whole rotating tastings have been cool opportunities to try different flavors and try different pairings. And I saw someone earlier ask about, do we always try the wines and the pairings beforehand? And at this point, the speed in which we're doing all of these and the specialness of some of the cheeses, it's just kind of impossible. And so there's a lot of hypotheses and trying them out. But we've been doing pairings for long enough that we have a lot of thoughts going into them. So with cheddars, you often hear about cheddars being so bold. There's not a lot of cheeses that hold up to the bigger reds. And so I wanted to have something that was nice and big red. So Ancient Peaks is coming out of Paso Robles, a little southern or more central coast within California, but cooler climates than Napa. So you generally get a Zinfandel or a Cab if you're talking about their Cab. It's a little quieter, a little more nuanced. And I think we're going to have that with this wine as well. And then the white is a total curveball. It's a really fun wine. Or vinous type drink. It is a piquette. So piquettes are a category of drink, goes back to Roman times. You often hear them referred to as simple wines as well. And it's the idea of you have this grape must after making a wine, add a little more water and let it kind of do its thing one more time. And we get a nice simple wine, right? So you could almost think of it as the ricotta of the wine world. It's getting that last cook out of it. And I think that this is a really cool, I love whenever I'm introduced to something that's brand new in my mind, but that goes back to Roman times. That's just fun to me. And I think that what's really cool about what Old Westminster is doing, the winery that's making this, is they're blending North American grapes and Venus vinifera. So I assume that not all of you have ever pondered the fact that we all kind of talk about a handful of grapes over and over, but those are Venus vinifera, the European grapes. But when we think about grape juice or things like kosher wine, you see Concord grapes and Vidal grapes and grapes that you would never see in the wine world, Vitis lambrusca. And these wines, or these grape varieties are often called the foxy grapes. Some people think they have some weird foxy qualities to them, which is more of a musty quality, not a sexy quality. And so generally they're not used for wine, they're more used for grape juice. But I think it's really cool that these guys are turning us on to some different grapes than we don't usually see. So this is a blend of Gruner Veltliner and Vidal. You'll also notice, thank you, Chelsea, for mentioning this, there's a fair amount of cloudiness and sediment in this, right? And that's partially because how it's made, this idea of taking that grape must and giving it one more life. If you don't like sediment, I would suggest you pour it slowly or pour it into a decanter first, which is going to kind of separate it from the sediment. If you're not bothered by sediment, it's totally fine. I'm just pouring and drinking without any extra step. But they're really fun wines, and I think they offer really interesting counterpoints as we talk about all these beautiful flavors that Cheddar can give us. Any questions so far, my friends?
Nope, all good.
All good on the Western Front. Cool. Okay, so let's jump into cheese. You've heard my voice for a little bit too long, but I want to first talk about this kind of cheddar series that we're talking about and talk about cheddar for a little bit. And then I'm going to let Tom talk about Shelburne Farms because he's going to do a much better job than I'll be able to. So cheddar is, America's favorite cheese in many ways, really until I believe it was the early 2000s. It might have been the late 90s. It was the #1 selling cheese in America. Low-fat mozzarella is now the answer, and it's really it's a matter of pizza, right? That's the answer to why we eat more of that cheese than cheddar. Cheddar has a great deal of history, a great deal of Americana, right? It's probably one of the most ubiquitous cheeses worldwide, but especially in America. It's a cheese that goes back to the UK, and we have a really special relationship with the UK as one of its former colonies. So cheddar has always been in our blood. At one point in the history of the colonies, we were actually making more cheddar than the UK and of a really high quality. I think there's often this kind of preconceived notion that America has always been making industrialized cheeses. And, we kind of gone in and out of that history. There's a really wonderful book if anybody wants to really nerd out along with Tom and I, because I imagine Tom's read this, but Cheddar by Gordon. Edgar. Gordon also wrote the book, My Life on the Wedge, Story of Being a Cheesemonger. And Gordon talks all about this kind of the history of us making better cheddar and then kind of the English market working against us and trying to besmirch the name of American cheese. And then there becomes this really dark history with filled cheeses. And I'm not going to really get into that because we're not talking about it today, but it's similar to making a margarine of cheese, right? Using different fats than are naturally available. And that's when we just tank our own reputation. We go from that into industrialized craft cheeses and stuff like that. And it takes us really until now to recover from our international reputation. And so that's part of the reason I really wanted us to take American cheddars today, right? I think that we've come interesting full circle, and we'll talk about this interaction between British history and American history in cheddar, but there's amazing cheeses coming out of America. It's also what we interact with more as general consumers. And so today we're going to talk about, 2 wonderful cheeses coming out of Vermont and 2 coming out of Wisconsin, as that's kind of the premier cheddar destinations in our country. And so before I turn it over to Tom, I want to take one last second to just define cheddar. And I invite Tom to add or subtract from this because I think it's not as easily defined as you might think it is, or we might want it to be. But at least historically, cheddar comes from Somerset, England, right? Right by Cheddar Gorge, it's a geography as well as a cheese. Now cheddar can come from anywhere, but it's going to be a cheese that is not necessarily from cow's milk, but commonly is. And once you have it down to a curd, you're going to salt the curd by hand, generally speaking, and you're also going to mill the curd. So this process is a process of cutting down curds to smaller pieces like the size of an English pea and then stacking, right? And cheddar is commonly made by that stacking method. And that's why when we think of the texture and the final product, it's really crumbly. So at this point, I've talked way too much. We should be eating the 2-year cheese at this point. You guys go ahead and try that. And I'm going to turn it over to Tom to tell you about it a little bit more.
Thank you, Zach. Another thing that I would add about cheddar, especially as we define it, or as it's defined here in the United States, Zach touched real briefly on English cheddar producers, and like they have a pretty set way in the way that they're going to be making their cheddar. If it's a PDO cheese, it needs to be from a specific region of England, and I won't go too deep into that. But as far as the USDA is concerned, it really just boils down to moisture content, because there's so many different ways that you can make cheddar cheese, and that's why it is as ubiquitous as Zach was saying. So, but I'll be happy to go into that a little bit later if anybody has any follow-up questions. So my name is Tom. I'm the cheese sales manager for Shelburne Farms. And I'm gonna be, normally I do a lot of events in New England, and people in New England have a pretty good familiarity with Shelburne Farms. Either they visited, as one of the people in attendance said, they went to UVM, and we're just outside of Burlington up in the northwestern corner of Vermont. So a number of people have a sense of who we are. But you folks, being primarily in Michigan, may not be as familiar. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Has that already happened? Did you do that for me, Benji?
Your
No.
screen is not being shared yet.
It is not. Okay, good. Okay, then I don't know. Okay, bear with me. I'm just going to share my screen real quick.
No
And
worries.
we'll go into this
Boom, there we go.
PowerPoint
There you go.
presentation, because everybody loves PowerPoint presentations. So, all right. So I'm going to give you a brief history of Shelburne Farms. So prior to European arrival in Vermont, the area that is now Vermont and New Hampshire was primarily inhabited by a group of Native American tribes that are known as the Western Abenaki. And Shelburne, indicated by the star on the map in the northwestern corner of the state, was home to a tribe called the Missisquoi. And the site where Shelburne Farms is located was used for hunting, fishing, and modest agricultural endeavors, and as a lookout over Lake Champlain to keep an eye on the Mohawk tribes that inhabited New York. But once the French and English came to North America and colonized the area, this led to wars and aggression and land grabs, and many of those Native American tribes ended up fleeing into Quebec. So this is a map of Shelburne circa 1857. Shelburne is on the shores of Lake Champlain. It's got a unique spit of land that forms the Shelburne Bay. And it's an absolutely gorgeous little town. If you're ever in Vermont, I highly advise coming up and seeing what we've got. We've got, in addition to Shelburne Farms, we've got the Shelburne Museum and some lovely wineries, and obviously craft beer producers. So Shelburne, as we know, was chartered as a town in 1763, and it was divided into land parcels by Ira Allen, who is the brother of Ethan Allen, who both Ira and Ethan were part of the Green Mountain Boys, known for their Revolutionary War exploits. Shelburne has always had a strong attachment to agriculture. It was a farming community. And what a lot of people don't know is that Vermont was very heavily involved with the sheep and wool trade in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s until the wool market crashed. And Vermont was actually clear-cut 70% for pasture land, and now it's the reverse. It's now 70% woodland. And so the part that we're talking about in regards to Shelburne Farms is in part to one family, the Vanderbilt Webb family, and they began setting up the country estate that became Shelburne Farms in the mid-1880s. They purchased 32 individual 100-acre plots of lands from various farms in the community. So if you're looking at the map of Shelburne, that is the area that Shelburne Farms' initial footprint was when they purchased all this land in the 1880s. And the woman that was behind this was Eliza, known as Lila Vanderbilt Webb. She was the youngest daughter of William, aka Billy Vanderbilt, who was the oldest son of Cornelius Vanderbilt. And when Billy died in 1885, he left a total of $10 million to Lila. And this inheritance allows her to and her husband to build Shelburne, or to purchase the property and build the buildings for Shelburne Farms. And I always like to point this out as a point of reference. The entire operating budget of the state of New York at the time was $9 million. So we're talking about some serious 1880s Gilded Age cash. And one thing that's also unique about this is typically during that time frame, women weren't inheriting property or money. So this was kind of on the progressive slant in terms of wealth sharing. And they really enjoyed it up here in Shelburne because being this far north allowed the family to be less engaged with the social activities that was going on in Gilded Age New York City. So a lot of folks, I'm guessing that a lot of you haven't been to Shelburne Farms before. So I love sharing the pictures of the buildings we have here. As I tell everybody, like working at Shelburne Farms really takes the edge off of going into work every day. And this is where I work. This is what's known as the farm barn. And even during the family's initial inhabitance there, this was always the center of life on the farm. And the primary interest, just as a point of reference, was in horse breeding during this time frame. And now we use it for administration. This is where we make our cheese, also this building here. And we also do a fair amount of our educational outreach in this building. This building here was the family residence, known as the country home, the family residence, the Shelburne House. Pardon me, is now the Inn at Shelburne Farm. So if you ever come in a non-pandemic year, you do have the option to stay with us. We also have a farm-to-table restaurant on property. And this year, that kitchen is being used to make value-added meals that we're selling for curbside pickup. This building here is the coach barn. If you, again, in a non-pandemic year, this would be where we hold the annual Vermont Cheesemakers Festival, which attracts about 1,200 to 1,500 people every year to taste not only the cheeses that we make at Shelburne Farms, but also the cheeses that we make or that our peers make all throughout the state. And it's a wonderful event. If you get the opportunity and there is no pandemic, I would love to see you here.
It's a lot of fun. I've gotten to go to that.
Yeah, I mean, it is an event and a half. Lastly is the breeding barn. This is my favorite building on the property. It's in the western, let's see, the southern acres of the farm. Over the years, the property that I showed you, or the amount of land that I showed you initially, had been divided up against between several different family members, and we didn't actually accrue this piece of property until the mid-90s. But this was the largest freestanding wooden structure in North America for 40 years. It's long enough that they were able to do time trials on the horses they were breeding in this breeding barn. As happens with a lot of families, they made some poor investments, and the introduction of the income tax led to like a kind of downturn in the family's fortunes. So they went from these Gilded Age parties, this is actually a Vanderbilt gathering at the Breakers down in Newport, Rhode Island, to using that same coach barn that I showed you a couple of slides earlier as basically a place where we kept our herd of brown Swiss cows. So how did we go from being a Gilded Age estate to making cheese? Well, the story is like this. The farm was essentially put on offer, or had an offer put in by the president of IBM, and he was going to develop the majority of the land that is what we consider Shelburne Farms into subdivisions. And the deal was that the Vanderbilts would be able to keep their dairy farm, and the great grandchildren of Lila and Seward Webb convinced their father, Derek Webb, not to sell and instead allow them the chance to keep the farm whole and to share it with the public. And those children are now, some of them are now part of our current leadership. So they formed the nonprofit Shelburne Farms Resources, Inc. in 1972. And they used those resources that were already on the farm, the herd of brown Swiss cows, the maple trees to make maple syrup, and the land. We started an organic market garden and actually were the founders of the Burlington Farmers Market back in the early 70s. However, I don't know if Zach has talked and Mongers Provisions has talked to you about the dairy crisis that is going on in a lot of America. But even back in the 70s and 80s, when prices for fluid milk were still relatively stable, it wasn't the revenue generator that the farm needed to kind of have operational to fund the endeavors that we wanted to have on hand. So the one thing that I always like to stress about the cheese that we make at Shelburne Farms is when every day we're just making cheddar. We've got multiple age profiles from 6 months to 3 years. We're not setting out to make a certain cheese age profile. It's not like we're making 6 month one day and we're making 2 year the next day. No, we're just constantly striving to make the best cheese that we can every single day. And we're really relying on the quality of the milk that we produce and the skill of our cheesemakers to make the best quality cheese that we can. A lot of the times we make some really great cheese, but sometimes we fall a little short. So there are a couple of things that make our cheese unique. Firstly, the cows. We are all brown Swiss all the time. And brown Swiss, as Zach may have talked about in his Alpine class, those are like the classic Alpine grazing cows that you would see on the Alp, producing cheeses like Gruyere and Hallerhocker, if you're familiar with that cheese. We're also a farmstead operation. A lot of conventional cheddar producers pool their milk, so that it's typically either through a co-op situation or they're working with multiple dairies to get their supply of milk. For us, so for farmstead, it means we're only using the milk that we produce on our farm from our herd of cows. So we're very in tune with the milk quality and with the health and nutrition that our cows are engaging in. The milk, we're using full fat, grass-fed, raw milk, and that's as simple as it gets. And last but not least, our land. We've spent the last 40 to 50 years restoring the pasture and grasslands to the native plants that would have inhabited the farm had it not been turned into an estate or into a conventional dairy for about 30 to 40 years. And also, it's got wonderfully mineral-rich soil, which I'll touch on in a bit. So I am going to stop sharing, and hopefully you've been trying the 2 year cheddar. And when for us at Shelburne Farms, we consider our 2 year cheddar to kind of be like the classic Vermont cheddar cheese. It's got that nice forward acidity, and even though it's we market it as extra sharp. Sharp is such a nebulous term that can get very muddied, and it's always great to have a cheesemonger that can kind of walk you through the differences between sharp and strong and really get you what you're looking for. So our 2 year is going to have that nice forward acidity. It's going to have some minerality in the middle, and then it's going to have like a nice little sweet uptick on the back end. One thing that, and one of the differences between Vermont cheddar cheese and Wisconsin cheddar cheese is this is only 2 years old. For some of the flavors that you would need to get from some of our Wisconsin cheesemaking peers, you're looking at either a 4 or sometimes even older cheese. And there aren't too many, like I said earlier, there are lots of ways to make a cheddar cheese. And one of the things that I learned about, literally only a couple of months ago, is a majority of Wisconsin cheesemakers will actually wash their curd to wash some of the lactose off. And that helps reduce bitterness, because Vermont cheddar cheese has a very specific profile. It's got that slight sulfury note, and I'll be happy to touch on that a little bit later as well. But that washing the curd and reducing the acid loadout really helps them create these cheeses that are capable of being aged 6, 8, 20 years. If you do get the opportunity to try them, some of them are really amazing. Sometimes they just turn into crumbly salt balls, but it's really cool to eat a 20 year cheese. I won't lie. And then lastly, one thing in particular that makes our cheese unique compared to our peers in Wisconsin is, the brown Swiss cows that we use. They are ideally suited for making cheese. That's what they've been bred for generations and thousands of years. Whereas in Wisconsin, and not obviously all cheese producers, they are relying more on Holsteins for their milk production, and that is a different protein and butterfat output. So a lot of people say that our cheese is like very fudgy and supple for a cheddar cheese of this age and this kind of flavor. And that's all I got to say about that.
Perfect. Cool. There's a couple
That's
of
awesome.
questions that came in. You kind of just answered it right there, but you just mentioned all your cows are brown Swiss. Does that mean different cows create different types of milk, which is why you always want that same type of cow?
Yes. So, different breeds of cow will produce different amounts of protein and butterfat. Obviously, different diets will contribute to that kind of output as well. A grass-based diet, we don't say we have a grass-based herd. We say we have a pasture-based herd, because grass is definitely much more attuned with the natural diet of cows, but just having them subsist on grass can lead to like some health deficiencies. So we balance it out with non-GMO grain mixture, which has some minerals. Because giving grass to a cow is like giving it rocket fuel. It takes a lot of energy to basically digest the grass fully, and that energy that is that is spent being like digested could be spent towards milk production.
Yeah. Totally. One more question for you, more jokingly, but someone asked, so you guys are the Sharks and Stone Barns is the Jets?
Stone Barn and with Blue Hills, we're different operations. There are a number of wonderful agricultural estates dotted throughout the country, whether it be us, whether it be Stone Barns, Blackberry Farms down in Tennessee. I think you guys got some really awesome stuff going on up at Mackinac Island out in Michigan. So it's all how we're approaching our own goals to produce value-added agriculture. And I'd be happy to engage with anybody about there are lots of ways to get to sustainability, and it's not a straight line. It's more like a spider web. And if you think about engaging in sustainability, you think of it as like the zero-sum activity that is just very overwhelming and daunting, but it's really taking small steps that ultimately form a larger picture.
Yeah.
So.
Totally. Zach, I'm going to throw it back to you. A couple questions, just general cheddar questions that I feel like are in your wheelhouse. Number one, why is sharp cheddar in the U.S. called mature cheddar in the UK? Do you know that little trivia bit?
It's kind of what Tom talked about before. Sharp means very little that we can all agree about. Tom and I have a verb, or we use sharp to mean something that you as a customer aren't saying. To that sulfur bit, sharp to a cheesemaker means shorter peptide chains that result in a sulfuric flavor that is cheddar, but we often say, I like a sharp cheese. You're meaning you like an intense cheese. So some people think of Florey's Truckle. If you guys remember that cheese from some of our cheddars, it was calling that sharp. I would say that's actually a really high acid cheese. It's not particularly sharp, it's high acid. And so I think that mature is just it's an older cheese. That's a stated fact. And sharp is this nebulous concept.
Perfect. And then the other one, most cheddars are orange in a lot of people's minds. What happened to that?
Yeah. So there's a great bit of history about dyeing cheeses. It really starts in the 1700s. We have to remember that so much of our dairy history comes from these really large estates, a feudal system or a monastic movement who are controlling dairy in an area. And you don't really have the trials and tribulation of an open market. At a certain point, this all starts to change, and you start as a farmer going to market, and consumers get wise very quickly. They start seeing fluctuations. Even if you look at these beautiful cheeses, you can see how gorgeous and orange, butter hue this has. This is clearly a grass-fed cow, as Tom was just saying. And as we get to Bluemont, you get a little more pale. And, you know, I don't know if Willie in this case has grass-fed milk or if it's a little different time of season, but there's seasonal fluctuations. Cows are unique compared to goats that they, as they eat grass, they pass keratin through their butterfat and give you this butterfat hue. And so at a certain point in history, pale cheeses sold less, so we just started coloring cheeses. And this way, you didn't have a clue. Are they eating grass? What season are they made in? And that's really where industrialized cheese gets its color from. But you know, they use a natto or achiote seed. It's a not very flavorful seed. So the same kind of thing you would make Spanish rice red with. And so, yeah, that's the story of colored cheeses. More common in Wisconsin, I'd say, overall than Vermont.
Correct.
Yeah.
And the other
Go ahead.
thing that I always like bringing up is like back when colorants and cultures, and I can talk all the other about that, but like when cheese ingredients were being developed in the 1800s, one of the first things on the market was butter colorant, and it was the Sonato, and it was used for butter to make it appear grass-fed.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I also, you know, I want to talk a little bit. Tom, thank you for showing us those pictures. As someone who's gotten the like amazing privilege of going to that Vermont Cheesemakers Festival and going to Shelburne Farms, it really is a place that it can't just be talked about. You need to see it. It's so beautiful. I've gone to a handful of creameries, and especially in California, there's some beautiful creameries, but like nothing quite hits like a Vanderbilt summer home. So it is a gorgeous, gorgeous piece of property. And I also, you know, want to just talk a little bit about how Shelburne, because of its rich history and because of its position in the market or position in that community, they've really been this amazing feeder school of cheesemakers. You know, I think many of you know, come from a culinary background. I cooked for a lot of years before I got into cheese. And in the culinary world, there's these kitchens that kind of inform a region, right? Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California, really built a lot of the Bay Area. Commander's Palace in the South really built a lot of the Southern chefs. And Shelburne ends up being one of these places that dozens of cheesemakers start at Shelburne Farms. And so it's they have such a wide impact on the community. I think it's really worth noting.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, we were trying to figure it out, and like, you know, Jasper Hill, Champlain Valley Creamery, where else? Parish Hill, you know, all of these places that have just developed a larger influence and market in the cheese world. They all got their start or did some work at Shelburne Farms.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. So let's go ahead and, while we're still talking and thinking of Shelburne and we're all mentally out in that beautiful place, let's go ahead and jump into this clothbound and introduce this idea of cloth binding cheeses, right? So I found it fascinating. I can even tell you where I was while I was reading this page of the Cheddar book. But Gordon talks about how we so think of cloth-bound cheddar as an English thing, right? And Tom mentioned this PDO idea, these great cheddars of the UK, and they're generally cloth-bound, right? Montgomery's cheddar, Westcombe cheddar. And so we think of it, this is like, oh, the British cloth bind, and the Americans, we like make wax blocks or just giant 40-pound blocks. But if you go ahead and think about the economics of the time, cloth binding was us, right? We had a, let's say, a competitive advantage on cloth and cotton at the time, right? We were in the middle of a slave economy. And so we had a crazy price on cotton, which is a huge part of the economic relationship with the UK to begin with. And cloth wasn't hard to make. We also have a much more volatile weather in the New England area than we did in the UK. And so the temperatures were really difficult on early cheesemakers, and cloth helped give a little bit more protection. It's pretty crazy when you read accounts of early cheesemaking. It sounds like a very hazardous job with like bubbling rinds and exploding cheeses. Luckily, we've learned a lot about microbiology in the last couple hundred years. So we don't usually see a wheel of cheese just explode on us anymore. But cloth binding was a way for the early settlers to kind of give a little layer of protection in a really volatile area. What ends up happening in this idea of, either paraffin wax or nowadays cryovac bags versus cloth binding, it's all about oxygen exchange, right? You create a porous environment, the cheese can get a lot of flavor from that. And so cloth binding cheeses, change the texture, right? You'll see this cheese is a lot drier, but it also gives it a lot of other flavors. I know that many of you guys have heard me talk about this before, but you maybe see me like sitting here and playing with my food as I talk about it. And, this is a really great example of a opportunity to learn information by kneading the cheese, right? Same milk, as Tom said, they're not going out making one or the other. It's the same milk. And so you can get a real sense of the different fat versus protein and all that from the two different cheeses. Yeah. What questions do we have?
Zach, how old is this particular cloth-bound cheddar, or maybe Tom?
So the date is what, 10/24/18, so a little shy of 2 years. I think we're looking at like 22 months right now. Yeah, and I would love to be tasting this cheese with you, but I literally sent Zach the last wheel. So I don't have any with me. But I've got another.
It's really good.
But thank you. I've got another bit of cloth bound from our larder. So Zach really touched on how we developed cloth bound or cloth binding here in the United States, and as Zach kind of mentioned earlier, we had, I guess we could call it diminished returns on our cheese trade starting in the late 1800s that led into the processed cheese. But prior to that, we were shipping tons of cheese over to England. It's insane when you read that book. Another great book that I love is Paul Kinstead's Cheese and Culture. Wonderful way to learn about kind of cheeseways and how the flow of information and trade really influenced what we consider to be the modern cheese world. So the 2-year cheddar that we had earlier, I didn't really get into it, but that's a classic block cheddar. That's what I would say 90% of the world, the United States, thinks of when they think of cheddar. And it's good, sharp, not rineless block. We produce it to be that way. We'll press the cheese. The next day we'll take it out. We'll throw it into a vacuum seal bag, and we'll let it do its thing for anywhere from 6 months to 3 or 4 years. And that's because the majority of the aging and flavor development that you get from a cheddar takes place in an anoxic or oxygen depleted environment. So, so much of what goes on with, proteolysis and lipolysis, protein and fat breakdown, it can occur in, an oxygen deprived environment, and it'll make amazing cheese. But what's cooler from my perspective is, allowing the elements to influence the effects and the flavor of a cheese. And I don't like to brag, but I will. But so Shelburne Farms was the cheesemaker that brought cloth-bound cheddar back to the United States. There are a lot of wonderful cloth-bound cheddars that are being made in the United States and Canada right now. Cellar the Jasper Hill ages Cabot cloth-bound. Florey's Truckle, which it seems like that's a regular staple at Mongers Provisions. Avonlea cloth-bound from our friends up in Canada, and on and on and on. West Coast, Midwest, and obviously Willie Laner's, which we're going to be trying after this one. So we brought it back in the late 80s, early 90s. We learned from a gentleman named Jamie Montgomery, who you've obviously got some Neal's Yard Dairy up there in Detroit. Yeah, Zach?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, every once in a while. We haven't had a Montgomery's yet. Maybe this Christmas.
Yeah. So we learned from Jamie, who similar to Shelburne Farms, has an equally lovely estate because he's part of the British nobility, and they have a Science of Cheese conference there every year. So we learned how to make it, and we took Best in Show in 1990 at the American Cheese Society Awards. And the thing that I love about clothbound cheddar is, it allows for this air and moisture exchange, and you're able to get so much more dynamic flavors in a shorter period of time. So even though this is encroaching on 2 years old, you were getting these similar flavors probably about like 3 months ago too. It's just that with, COVID, not a lot of people are reaching out for clothbound. So thank you, Zach. Our clothbound is a little bit different from our peers here in the United States, which tend to veer more on the caramely side, brothy side. We like to think of ourselves as being a little more in line with the classic English clothbound cheddar. So a little more horseradishy, earthy, musty flavors, mustardy even. And that is achieved in part because we actually farm out our aging to our friends at the cellars at Jasper Hill. We helped them get a grant so that they could build the cellars back in the early 2000s. And they in turn gave us 2 shelves in Vault 4 at the cellars at Jasper Hill. And I don't know if you've ever talked to your friends about the cellars, but I mean, it's the bunker of cheese. Like I always
Cathedral of cheddar.
Yeah, I always say to people, like, if you imagine that scene in The Matrix where like he's like, I need guns, change that with like, I need cheese, and it's like a similar kind of effect. And we've got 2 little shelves over in the corner, surrounded by like wheels upon wheels, 30,000 wheels of Cabot clothbound. So that's primarily what I got to say about our clothbound, and I'm really jealous that you guys got Willie's to try after that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We need to send you a box. Benji, what are your questions?
Quick question that came in for Tom. So you mentioned kind of the aging process. So you mentioned a 20-year cheddar. We've had the Hooks 20-year here. What's the oldest cheddar that you guys make, and have you ever even considered coming close to a 20-year cheddar?
So that's a really great question. So like that goes back into breed dynamics. So because we're using brown Swiss cows, brown Swiss are known for their equal levels of butterfat and protein. And really, unfortunately that butterfat, which makes for that really nice fudgy texture, is also partly an Achilles heel. It doesn't allow for super long aging because essentially that excessive like fat amount can lead to what are known as like butyric or putrid flavors that develop throughout the aging process. So we're always trying to nip flavors like that in the bud. And the longest that I know, or that I've been on hand for, that we've produced is 4-year cheddar. And I think that there was once a 5-year that was produced many, many moons ago. But that's the farthest that we've gone down the road. And, we're also, not taking any steps to ensure like a guaranteed outcome. Like we're not, so a lot of cheddar producers will use this cheese culture known as Lactobacillus helveticus. And what this culture will do, it's considered a non-starter lactic acid bacteria, which means it's more of a flavor contributor. But and it's typically found a lot in Goudas and Alpine cheeses as a naturally occurring microbe, and that's what produces those sweeter, nuttier flavors. But in cheddar, because you're not bringing that temperature way up high into the like 120s to 150s, what it does is it actually, as it degrades, it cuts through like bitter peptides, and that's how you reduce bitterness. So it's kind of like an insurance policy that some cheesemakers will use to ensure that their cheeses are capable of aging for like 4 or 20 years, but we don't do that.
Yep.
And I don't fault anybody that does, because like if you're able to make a 20-year cheddar, more power to you, because God bless you.
Yeah.
And what was the second? Oh, so we have never come close to that.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Cool. I'm going to shoot it
I
back
think
to you,
it's,
Zach.
yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning, Tom mentioned this idea of Holsteins in Wisconsin. Holsteins are milk machines. They produce a really abundant amount of milk, but they don't have that even butterfat content. And so that's why you see the Wisconsin cheeses going so far out. For major extra credit, to the point where I will send anybody a chocolate bar who gets this right, who's not one of our staff members. Tom mentioned this idea of washing the curd. And I wanted to know if anybody who's been paying attention to our tastings can think of another cheese where it's a washed curd cheese that we talked about in a recent tasting. So the winner, if anybody says this in the chat, gets a chocolate bar on me. But I think that Tom also mentioned another thing I really want to highlight, which is this nuanced idea that the cloth-bound, same age, just gives you a ton of different flavors, right? And so it's important for wine pairings especially, right? I don't know if anybody's tried any of these cheeses with the wine yet, but I think it was fascinating. I picked the Paquette because it has this bright pineapple-y flavor, right? Which we get in some of our cheddars. Back to the Fleury's Truckle, it very much has some of those same notes. When I tried it with the 2-year, we talk about these complementary versus contrasting pairings. That would have been a complementary pairing, was the grassiness and the high acid, but it was too much, right? I thought the 2-year goes much better with the red, that kind of brambly or jammier wine goes great with that grassiness, and they all kind of work really well. So the contrast was actually safer bet than the complementary. When we go to the second cheese and you have the horseradish, and I saw someone's mentioned the mushroom, I think that's a great note, this like mustiness, it gives the acid and the pineapple a little foil in the Paquette. So I think it works really well. And I think the red wine's really nice too with it, but I actually thought it was nice to finally find something to go well with this Paquette. So we talk a lot about pairings here, right? And I've used 2 terms that I think are important, complementary versus contrasting, but you still need language to kind of categorize these tastings. And, many of you have been here and know our kind of scale, but just to run through it quickly, I learned this from Daphne Zeppos, who passed away well before her time, but was a huge figure within the industry. And Tom's going to talk a little bit more about her legacy. But, Daphne, when we were doing a class, laid out this idea of pairings being judged at a -2 to +3. And so -2, what does that mean? You brush your teeth in the morning, you go downstairs, you have a big glass of OJ. -2, right? Nothing is good about that experience, right? There's no tropical sweetness. There's no minty fresh. You're just having a bad start to your day. A -1, we might remember these moments. They used to be called parties we used to go to, like cocktail gatherings. There'd be these large tables, many different foods. We'd be eating. You're drinking your wine, you're eating, and all of a sudden you hit something. When you go back to your wine's ruined. It's totally metallic. It's bitter. Something in your mouth interacted with the wine poorly, right? That is a -1, right? The wine was fine the food was fine going down, but the wine got ruined. A 0, I think this is most food interactions, right? Not everything has this profound romantic interaction. I think some foods don't really dance that way. I also think the other piece, B, is that we're just not mindful about it, right? If I'm on the couch and I'm drinking and eating, I don't have my notepad out. There's no pairings. I'm just enjoying myself. So that's a 0. We get to +1s. I like to think of cooking red sauce, cooking my tomato sauce. I add a little red wine and I bring up the acid, and all of a sudden, oh, that is the best tomato sauce ever. I did no favors for my wine though, so I only get a +1. A +2, maybe you've already had, right? A +2 is this idea of things balancing out and, just enhancing a little bit. So I think this cloth-bound is awesome, but if you tasted it and first you thought it was maybe a little too salty or a little too dry or something like that, and then maybe the red wine you thought was a little too big and hot, but when you tried them together, the kind of fruitiness of the wine added some kind of saltiness to the cheese, not saltiness, but brought out the creaminess of the cheese and brought out that contrast. And then the salt in the cheese and the lactic flavors of the cheese kind of softened the wine a little bit and brought out maybe some of that pepper note that's hiding back there. So the horseradish maybe played that out. And so everything just got elevated a little bit. That's a +2. And I think that's a great pairing situation. We really aim at +2s. +3s are really rare. I think +3s, I like to call them the peanut butter jelly effect, right? The parts are better or the sum are better than the parts. We have created a brand new flavor, peanut butter and jelly. And from now on, we rarely eat peanut butter by itself, right? We want to combine them. And I think that those famous pairings are talked about throughout history because they are so famous, right? Sauterne and Fagua, Port and Stilton, they're classic for a reason. And I think that they're really fun to celebrate. And hopefully we find in this ever search for different new pairings, we find a couple plus twos, and you know the rules. If you ever find a plus three, if your jam and cracker combination with the wine and everything was this perfect symphony of flavors, text the group so we can all experience this plus three. They're so rare, you should be sharing them with your friends. So that is the wine spiel. Tom, do you mind talking a little bit about Daphne and how you interacted with Daphne? Because I wanted to talk about that a little bit.
You had so much more interaction with Daphne than I did.
I got lucky.
You did, and she had a really wonderful relationship with Zingerman's that really blossomed, and I feel like they were like customer one for Essex Street cheese.
Yes.
And I think if enough of the people, the audience, they may have been at Jules' class earlier in the year. So I was the very fortunate recipient of what is now Daphne's legacy, known as the Daphne Zeppos Teaching Award. And it's basically a scholarship that's given to people in the food industry. You don't necessarily need to be in cheese, but you definitely need to be in, restaurants or in some part of the supply chain for the food industry. And I was the third recipient back in 2015. And I wanted to understand or have a better understanding how the classic cheeses that we know, so cheeses like Gruyere, cheeses like Comté, and then some of the English cheddars and territorial cheeses really nailed down their flavor profiles and like what kind of research they did. So I learned a lot about starter cultures and the ways that they were developed and identified. And that was what my research was. Other research that's been done, before and since was about heritage breed animals. We had my friend Vince, or our friend Vince, who worked at the cellars at Jasper Hill and at Grafton. He did a deep dive into different cheddar cheese profiles, like what is cheddar cheese, and he brings up a very good point, like that because cheddar doesn't have any set rules, like it can be anything. It can be what we're experiencing now, or it can be essentially this new wave of cheddars that have that very sweet aroma. A classic example is Prairie Breeze, and when I was a monger, that was bread and butter, because like Americans like sweet, and like they will gobble it up. And it's a wonderful story, like this collaborative of Amish farmers in Iowa, like they were seeing diminished returns on their agricultural investment, and then it was like, oh, let's add a lot of Lactobacillus helveticus, and bam, Prairie Breeze. So
thank you, Neville McNaughton.
Yeah. Yep. And if you do get the opportunity, it is worth seeing what direction cheddar is kind of going in some circles. And then our most recent recipient, Ann Campbell, did this amazing presentation on just kind of reframing our view on where cheese traditions come from. She did a great presentation on cheeses from Egypt and Greece and the Middle East, and how that influenced what we consider to be the cheese industry that we know and love today. And as far as my own personal interactions with Daphne, it was always a phone call. It would be like, hello, and I'm like, hi, who's this? This is Daphne. And she would always want to talk to my boss, because she was the one that did, she was the one that did the imported cheese ordering, and I was the domestic cheese buyer. So unfortunately that was my interaction with her. But the one thing that I always remember is actually the first time I met you, Zach, was at the Cheesemonger Invitational back in 2012, which is unfortunately when Daphne died. Adam Moskowitz, who is responsible for the Columbia cheese line, Schnebelhorn and Gruyere 1655, among others. Hollerhocker, obviously. He was selling shirts, raw milk Rockstar, and $5 for every shirt sold was initially going to go to a treatment fund for Daphne. And unfortunately, she passed. Like Jewel and Leah, who are principals at Essex, they knew that she wasn't going to make it. So the money that he raised actually became the first official donation to DZTA back in 2012. So, and that was the seed money to get the scholarship started. But, you know, in regards to microbes, I mean, like one of the people that I talked to for my learning was Willie Lehner, whose cheese we're going to try next. And Zach has a much better grasp on what Willie does, but he's a gypsy cheesemaker. He's bringing in milk from whoever will sell it to him. He prefers to work with raw milk. Wisconsin has an interesting like network of cheese factories. Like, you know, my understanding was at their peak, you know, you couldn't go 8 miles without hitting a cheese factory essentially. And the reason that I wanted to talk to Willie was, you know, back in, oh gosh, like 2005, 2006. And Willie is a, what, 3rd generation cheesemaker?
Mm-hmm.
Zach? His family is from Switzerland. His father was a cheesemaker and his grandfather before him. And Willie dug about like 6 inches into the ground and created this slurry, and it developed like this starter culture that he used to make cheese. And like, it was so sensational. It was like, people are like, you can't do that. And he was like, no, but I did. So again, I'm very jealous that you're all trying some of Willie's clothbound cheddar, because it is some of the best in America. Speaking as another cheddar producer, you know, that's very high praise.
That is very high praise. So we're going to go from Vermont down to Bluemont, Wisconsin to try, or Blue Mound, Wisconsin, to try Bluemont cheddar or Willie Leonard cheddar. And Tom, thank you for that introduction. It's such a cool cheese, but it's so different than everybody else's story, right? This like nomadic cheesemaker, you know, either using Upland's Dairy or Idlewise, or I forget the name. I believe that's the name of it. But he's using whoever's milk and whoever's facility he can. He has his starter culture in hand, and then he has his capes. And he produces this amazing clothbound cheddar. And it's so cool to try them next to each other. You know, so rarely we get to try an idea over and over from different people. You know, I do a lot of tasting, but it's more rare that I do side-by-side tastings. And I think this is a really great example to get that idea of the grassiness and the minerality that Tom talked about versus that sweeter Wisconsin cheddar, right? This is still clothbound. There's still that horseradish note. There's still that cave notes, but it's so different. And I think it's fascinating. You know, we've talked about Jamie Montgomery a couple times, and I just want to, you know, mention, I love Willie Leonard cheddar from like a very much a cheese buyer standpoint, because he makes these cute little 10-pound wheels with the flavor of a 50-pound cheddar. And so from an inventory standpoint, it's amazing. And the reason I bring this up in conjunction with Jamie Montgomery is one of the coolest moments I've ever had in my entire cheese career is Jamie Montgomery visited Bayreuth, and he took a piece of cheddar, and the profile of a full piece of clothbound English cheddar is a piece of cheese like this, right? It's a large piece of cheese. And he drew with a knife an XY axis on this wedge of cheese, and then we tasted it along the axis. And it changes. We don't think of the anatomy of a cheese very much, but what the flavor is right under the rind versus the heart of the cheese is very different. And in a 10-pound cheese, it's not as different as a 50-pound cheese, and you have that much distance. And so, you know, obviously we love this idea of nerding out and going deeper than you ever thought about a piece of cheese. Like, where in the wheel did my cheese come from? Not just where in the world did my cheese come from? And so it was just a mind-opening moment. And I think that it's, one day we're going to have a Montgomery cheddar, because I want to give you guys that experience. But until then, we are so lucky to have something this close to us as Willie Leonard cheddar. It's just so much flavor. Yeah. What questions do we have? I feel like Tom and I have been talking for a minute. Have we had any questions?
No real questions right now. People are definitely loving on the cheeses. There was a little bit of a discussion on cheese s'mores, if you've ever tried that.
I saw that going on. So the answer that I was thinking of for that is I've seen a recipe for Brunost or Yay Toast, right? This caramelized whey cheeses, or Ski Queen, if you know the brand that we sell, being added to a s'more. I have yet to do it. I think you need to do it with a torch as opposed to the campfire in that case, but let's do it. I'm about it. I think it's a great idea.
In
Cheese,
regards to
marshmallows,
cheese,
chocolate.
cheddar s'mores, at Shelburne Farms, we actually have a package that you can get delivered to you called Shelburne S'mores, which is our 2-year cheddar, which you've got on hand. And we do it with a salted maple cracker that's made here in Vermont. And then we drizzle some honey on it. We don't apply any heat, but you know, it's more of it's definitely a more sweet thing. So,
Perfect.
you know,
Do you have that link? Someone's already requested a chance to order it, so throw it in the chat.
Yep. Well, I can definitely do that. But you know,
Yeah,
as always,
order 2.
shop locally with your cheesemongers, because you know all of this is a complete ecosystem. Like we love to get you our products, but I mean, you know, think about the carbon footprint. Think about the small business that you're supporting locally to you. I mean, I think Zach said that there's somebody in Illinois. I'll gladly ship you cheese. But the rest of you that are in Metro Detroit, you know, please go and visit Zach, because without him, you know, we're just selling 180,000 pounds of cheddar to our friends here in Vermont. And I'll pull up that link for everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, so we have one more cheese before we jump into chocolate. Dunbarton Blue. I you know, it was, as I was thinking of all the amazing cheddars in this world, the cheese, trying to figure out which ones to showcase, it was really difficult. And I would say the one that I knew going into it that I couldn't skip over was Dunbarton Blue. It's been a favorite of our shop for a really long time. And, you know, I always say that we're here to connect you with people, and that I'm just selling all my friends cheese, right? You've heard me say that several times, and there's some truth to it. I have a wonderful connection, and through my travels, I've gotten to spend time with Tom. It's not just, you know, a Zoom meeting here and there. We've spent time, we've had a drink together, we've had some cheese. It makes a difference. And, you know, I haven't yet hung out with Willie. It will happen. But I have hung out with Chris, and Chris is an amazing cheesemaker, and his story is so cool. You know, back to this idea of Wisconsin and how the landscape is defined by dairying in many ways. Chris can talk about that better than any of us. And he grew up in a cheese family that did 2 things. They were a milk pooling parlor and a cheese maker. And so everybody in the area that didn't want to make cheese but still wanted to live that dairy life, they bring milk to the milk pooler, and the milk pooler makes these big cheddars. And that's the life they lived for a really long time until you know, they saw that milk price collapse and all these troubles, and, you know, eventually they got out of the milk pooling business. But somewhere along the line, they pulled Chris back into the cheese making. And, you know, the story I've always heard is that Chris, you know, agreed. He kind of begrudgingly took on this mantle, but the agreement was that he was going to push them past commodity cheese. He was willing to go back into the family business, but he didn't want to make these swimming pool vats of anonymous cheddar. It just didn't sit right with him. But, you know, there's a real economy of making those. And so he continued to make those while spending his evenings on his grandfather's cheese making vat, much smaller, perfect for experimenting. And he came up with this recipe where he's really mimicking these English cheddars that we keep talking about. And what's a real hallmark of these cheddars is that they have bruises. I always wanted to make a t-shirt, real cheddars have bruises, because they have little cracks that, you know, become blue vein highways through a cheese, and there's all these imperfections. And you can almost, you know, I don't know what wedge you have, but you can see it in my Shelburne one. There's this little bruise, and like, that's where the flavor comes from. And so Chris is like, I'll show you a bruise. He just makes these beautiful blue streaks, you know, it's like an ice pick. But he's hand piercing the cheese and giving it these, you know, 4 or 5 streaks of blue. And I always say that this is not Gateway Blue, it's Cheddar Plus. And I know that that's like a silly Zach Berg made up distinction, but it eats like a cheddar with all this flavor of these English cheeses. It does not, to me, eat like a mild Roquefort or a mild cow's milk blue even. I think it's just such a cool idea that he really made an American original. I was lucky enough when he first started to make this cheese, he also then drove to Zingerman's to sell it alongside us so he could get customer feedback and like direct feedback. So my first chance meeting Chris, he was like a young cheesemaker, a young on the scene. And, you know, years later, that cheese has won a tremendous amount of awards and really solidified it as one of the great American cheeses. So it's really cool to kind of see the whole arc of that cheese. And I love it so much. It's so flavorful. And the wheel I have, or the chunk I have, is also incredibly creamy. For me, this is, you know, really why I brought the Zinfandel out in many ways, was for this cheese. I think it just really brings out the fruity notes of the cheese. It brings out some of the more earthy tones of the Zinfandel. It's a really fun pairing in my mind. Yeah, Dunbarton Blue.
Perfect.
Do you ever carry the Red Rock, Zach?
We do. Yeah, we have here and there. And the Red Rock is that same idea with a little bluing, but it's an annatto colored cheese, and it's made in the classic 5-pound block. And Will, I think, recently posted on his own social media some Red Rock burgers, I believe, were made at his house. Is that correct, Will?
Yeah, he just mentioned that in Dunbarton burgers as well. So, Will, you want
Yeah, if you guys remember the wonderful Gold Cash Gold in Corktown, they used to make a Dunbarton cheeseburger that was real serious stuff.
Yeah, I love blue cheese, like love it, and I love cheddar. And sometimes blue cheese on a burger is, you know, it's just a little bit too much when you only do blue cheese, but like Red Rock or Dunbarton gives you the best of both worlds. Like a little bit of that blue flavor, but it doesn't overpower the beef, and you still get the like cheddar flavor coming through. It's an exceptional combination.
Beautiful. Before we move on to chocolate, Benji, did anybody answer my special trivia question?
I don't remember what the special trivia question was. There were some answers at the beginning, so I believe so.
It was about washing curd. If anybody knew what cheese we had talked about, that was a washed curd cheese.
There was a couple guesses in there.
We got some answers.
I feel one was correct.
One was correct.
I think one was correct.
All right.
Dave,
someone get the
with Marieka Young Gouda got it.
So the answer was Goudas. That idea, all Goudas, it's one of the hallmarks of Goudas, is this idea of washing away the very acidifying whey to make way for what ends up being a sweeter cheese. So I thought it was very interesting, Tom. Thank you for that point. I didn't know how common that was in cheddar production, but it makes all the sense to my palate that now that you say it.
And to be honest, I didn't know it either until Erica Kubik, who has a cheese page called Cheese Sex Death. She was like, "Can I run the cheddar making steps by you?" And like, it was like, and then you wash the curd, and I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And then like, I reached out to my friend Katie, who works for Wisconsin Dairy Farmers, which is a nonprofit cheese association in Wisconsin. She's like, "Oh yeah, all the cheddar makers do that. They're just washing the curd and gets rid of the lactose." So I'm like, "Oh, okay, it's all coming together now." So
that's so funny. We're always still learning. It's that's the beauty of cheese,
yeah.
And really specialty goods in general. So with that, are we ready to move to chocolate, friends? Were there any cheese questions before we go to that?
A couple of people loving on the Dumbarton, but no cheese questions. A couple combos saying to mix some of the apricots, the Blue Mont cheddar and apricots is great. Someone saying the Dumbarton and the Maru are great together, so they've gotten a little bit ahead of you. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I saw there were some tasting notes from Jameson, so we definitely want to talk about those. You've developed quite a reputation in our tastings, I feel like. So Maru is this awesome chocolate company we love and we've worked with a lot. Will got the benefit of actually visiting, which is super cool, on southern Vietnam. Wow, it has to be probably 4 years now, 5 years maybe, ago. And so, real quick to back up before I just jump right into Maru, we just spent a really long time talking about cheddar, but not just like in this broad stroke. We talked about it really granularly, and that's what we love doing. We love this idea of connection, right? Hopefully you connected to the people you're tasting with. Hopefully you connected to some people on the Zoom, but even more so, hopefully we connected you to this beautiful, passionate farm in Vermont, or Willie Leonard, this mad scientist in Wisconsin, or Chris, who's, progressing his family's tradition and changing cheese in some ways in America. And that's what we want to do. And chocolate's no different, right? I think that the history of a chocolate in the industrialized age has been really, it's a little shameful how we've kind of ignored where it came from. And so I always like to remind people, if I would have asked you in the beginning of this tasting to name your favorite chocolate, I would guess a really high percentage of the group would have said something like Swiss chocolate, Belgian chocolate, German chocolate. And these aren't wrong answers. Those are wonderful chocolate producing countries or manufacturing countries, but they don't grow chocolate. Chocolate grows in this really narrow band, 20 degrees north or south of the equator, coffee being in a similar band, 25 degrees north or south. And Will and I love this because it gives us so much more of the globe to connect you to. You know, we've traveled in some cases to these places, and our hopes is that we can, you know, elevate your chocolate experience and give you an appreciation for how much work goes into chocolate. And so I really feel like I'm on a crusade against the $1 chocolate bar. It's this idea that, you know, there's no mechanical way to harvest chocolate anywhere in the world. So to make a chocolate bar, someone climbed a tree, they cut out a pod with a machete, they went on the floor, they split that pod, and then they separated all the beans, they let that ferment, they dried it, they roasted it, then they shipped it across the world. There's just too many steps for a chocolate bar to cost $1. And so we really love giving a showcase to what is called craft chocolate or bean to bar chocolate. We like to showcase chocolate makers as opposed to chocolatiers. Chocolatiers is an art form unto itself. I mentioned earlier that we started a chocolate shop in Royal Oak, and I tried my hand at chocolatiering, and Will can definitely attest to this. I'm terrible at it. I can't make anything look pretty in chocolate to save my life. I was in charge of making the junk food because it was literally a mess of chocolate and snack food. It didn't need to look that pretty. So chocolatiering is an art form. We love some of the local chocolatiers like Bon Bon Bon, but what they're doing differently is that they're buying chocolate. And Alex is really particular about whose chocolate she's buying. So she's very much buying ethical chocolate, but we want to be closer to that connection. We want to buy chocolate from people who are buying beans and making chocolate. And it's this whole process of direct trade. You know, Fair Trade is a really wonderful organization. And I think if you think of it as a bottom idea, you know, a common denominator or something, Fair Trade's great, right? The problem with Fair Trade is that Fair Trade is an organization. And so they also take some percentage, and we want to get as much money to the farmers as possible, right? It's similar to how Tom was talking about how the landscape of Vermont at some point was cleared and now it's all, you know, become forest. And, you know, protecting your landscape, protecting your community, it might seem like a too large of an idea for us to affect, or maybe something that's out of our control, but it's really important. You know, if you like the idea of living in an agrarian area, it needs to stay productive and as an agrarian area. And the same goes to the world of chocolate. And I think that we really want to continue to help farms that are doing the right things and sell their chocolate. And so we've really loved building Michigan's largest selection of craft chocolate. And Maru has been at the cornerstone of that from the beginning. And what makes Maru really special is they're actually at the country of origin. You know, if you think of things like Jamaica Blue Mountain coffee, many people in Jamaica aren't drinking that, right? The majority of people. It gets exported. And this is a really cool opportunity to flip that on its head. In Vietnam, chocolate's history is an imperialist history. It's the French colonial rule, and they grow chocolate. And so
The Belgians,
what
don't forget about the Belgians.
and the belt, thank you. And what Maru did that I think is so unique is not only are they taking chocolate and making it, but they're also opening up cafes within Southern Vietnam so they can encourage a chocolate culture of their own. And so now if you want, you can go into a cafe in Southern Vietnam and get a drinking chocolate or a truffle. So we just love them. Every color bar correlates with a different part of Southern Vietnam. And so similar to conversations we might have had about wine or even cheddar, right? What's the difference between a Shelburne cheddar or Cabot cheddar, you know, very geographically not that far and then aged in the same place. Well, we can have those conversations with that level of specificity and sophistication about chocolate. What's the difference between chocolate grown on one side of the Mekong Delta versus the other? And so that's what we're really aiming to do with our chocolate program. And at this point, we have, like I said, this incredible selection. And if you wanted to go on this like granular journey of village by village or province by province, you can do it in Southern Vietnam, you can do it in Peru, Venezuela, Nicaragua, these are all places that you could really try several states within a country. So yeah, check out our chocolate selection. It's really something we've become very proud of. And I'm wearing my Poor People's Campaign shirt, which I think is, you know, it's a perfect segue, this idea that it takes a lot of work to make your food. And I think that it's important that we as a culture celebrate that. And that's what we really hope to be doing at Mongers. All these people who make our food are all so busy making our food and trying to sustain. And so making sure that they're getting a livable wage is really why we spend so much time talking about these wonderful products. And, you know, we're just so thankful that we have this opportunity and this platform. So thank you for letting me stand on my soapbox. I hope at this point you've tried the chocolate and saw that it's not just amazing ethically, but it's delicious as well.
Can I touch on something in that regard?
Please, please.
So, you know, I'm wearing the Cheese Leads campaign, you know, supporting the chefs. And one thing that we've really observed since the pandemic started is how much of our cheddar went into food service, was being used at restaurants. And, you know, when you think about it, it's just sort of like, well, yeah, it's cheddar. But I mean, like, I'm not going to lie, Shelburne Farms cheddar is not the cheapest block cheddar that you can get on the market. And for people, especially restaurateurs, where your margins are, you know, wafer thin, you know, for them to like really engage with purchasing Shelburne Farms cheddar over, you know, and I'm not disparaging Cabot, they make a wonderful product, and like if it works for what you need it to do, awesome. But, you know, the price difference is definitely noticeable. And for them to go out of their way to purchase our cheddar cheese because they want to commit to a, you know, a minimum threshold or, you know, a ground floor of what they want from a food producer, that really speaks volumes. And, you know, as I was saying, like, you know, all of this food is part of a complete ecosystem. Like, there's been such a shift to order directly from farmers, and that's wonderful. You know, like, farmers definitely need our help, but I mean, like, in the end, like, you know, unless you want to get packages constantly shipped to you from FedEx, you need to rely on local businesses that are providing you with the goods that you crave and that you want to support because they're working within an ethics system that you think is important. So, you know, support restaurants that are supporting local farms and that are supporting small producers. You know, that is the real trickle down economics. So thank you for letting me soapbox that part.
Thank you. Thank you. I love this idea of I mentioned it in a couple of social media posts recently, this constellation of small businesses that we're all made up of, or all a part of. Benji, do we have any questions? And what was Jameson's tasting notes or pairing? I saw the name flash.
Totally. So yeah, we do have one question, more for kind of a future tasting. Will we ever have a tasting showcasing South American chocolate wine and pairing with cheese? So nice recommendation there for sure.
It's a cool idea. Yeah.
In terms of Jameson, he did recommend the triple berry jam, some Dunbarton and the cracker all together. We got a second on the Dunbarton and the chocolate together. So I don't know if you've tried that yet, but could be a good combo.
Yeah, I happen to love Vietnamese chocolate with blue cheeses. That's like a classic in our wheelhouse. My favorite in that is it's the Bailey Hazen with the 78. Is that Ben Trey will? I don't remember which province that is, but the 78% with the Bailey Hazen is always a go-to. And so I think that you're playing the same concepts at hand, this kind of spiciness that has the cinnamon notes. What was that?
Ben Trey is correct.
Awesome. Yeah, and you know, Will, he loves to tell the story of when he's standing in the room at the facility with Vincent, one of the owners, and he's like, come on, you can tell me there's a little cinnamon in this chocolate. And he's like, no, there's not. And he's like, yeah, just a little bit, you know. And there's no Bissell cinnamon in this. It's just chocolate. But that's the nature of the terroir of that region. And so the spiciness just really plays up the kind of fruity notes of blue cheese. They go really well. Yeah.
Perfect. There was a question earlier that Will did a great job of answering in the chat, but asking if Mongers carries all these cheeses on a regular basis, and you know, we'll answer kind of why we don't. But if you want to, put it on in the chat, it's a good question.
It's a great question, and it's something that I spend way too much time thinking about. And this, like, we want to introduce you to this ever-changing variety of new cheeses, but I think many of you guys have had the experience of walking into your favorite cheese shop and being like, "Oh, can I get a wedge of X?" And we're like, "No, we don't do that anymore." And you're like, but I made this sandwich. I love the sandwich this way. Like that's what I put in my eggs every morning. You know, cheeses and our hopes, they occupy like an emotional space in your life. You love the cheese, and so we really try to, you know, have a good balance of the things that are always here, right? Like if you don't see Lemieux's Gouda in the case, you know something went wrong. And then the cheeses that we try to introduce you to new cheeses. And so this I always think of as this great opportunity to let it go trial by fire, right? If we do a tasting and everybody freaks out about a cheese and calls me and is like, I need a wedge, that cheese is in our supply chain, right? It becomes one of our cheeses. And so, yeah, that is the answer. Things you see in and out. And that's the fun of our tastings. And we always are trying to find new cheeses. And especially right now where I don't get to go to a food show and taste cheeses, all of these cheeses between the Mongers Club, the subscription club, and these tastings is how I've tasted new cheeses this year. So it's been, you know, it's been a very different year in terms of that buying culture for us.
Perfect. We got a question. You know, can we do a meat and cheese tasting, which is also a good segue into Jameson's. We have 2 upcoming Conservas tastings for those unfamiliar, and he asks, he's uncertain about Conservas tastings / a fish tasting. What's unique about those? Why those flavor combinations should pique his interest? I don't know if you or Will wants to.
Yeah, Will, please take it. But I just really wanted to say one moment. I loved Will's copy he wrote in the Conserva tasting, because it really, to me, that's the whole thing. It's not just from your grandfather's bomb shelter sardines, right? In America, we think so much of fish is like, or canned fish is a preservation method of like catastrophe. And so much of the rest of the world takes the best possible thing and tries to capture it in a snapshot by canning it. And so we're really excited to show you this prettier side. It's not wartime rations. It's the best sardine you've ever imagined, done with like the most amount of respect, canned in beautiful olive oil. And so the first one is going to be all focused on fish, and then the second one all on mollusks and cephalopods and whatnot. Will, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Sorry.
No, I mean, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. Like the best canned sardines that we can get are better than a mediocre fresh sardine by a long shot. You know, these like little tiny sardines canned at their peak they're so clean, they're so light, and then there's so many kind of like cheese making. There's a ton of variations on them. You know, you've got stuff with flavors, things in like white wine, and muscadet is one we're going to be featuring this week, to just like pure olive oil. And then when you go into cephalopods and stuff, like they really look to highlight the brininess of a, you know, squid or a clam or something. And it's really cool to see the variability of these products. I mean, obviously, like if you taste 100 cans of sardines, you probably won't find the same, you know, flavor delta that you might in 100 different cheeses. But, you know, people get into it. In doing research, there's this guy's got a blog that's just like, I mean, it's off the deep end. It's called like, you know, canofsardines.com, you know, something like that. It's this guy in North Carolina, and he literally has ratings for hundreds and hundreds of cans of sardines. No other fish. Like, I don't think he has a rating for any canned tuna, no shellfish, nothing. He just rates sardines. He rates them on a 1 to 5 sardine scale. Would he eat them again? Would he not? And like, it's remarkably nerdy and right up our alley, and not to a depth that we'll ever go, probably.
Yeah.
If we do, you know, if I ever get there, Jameson, you and I can self-immolate together. I hope not to go that far down a rabbit hole of canned fish.
Yeah, you thought we were niche. Boy.
One thing that I want to say is, like, if any of the people on this chat, if you go to Portugal, it's like conservis tin fished all the time. Like you cannot escape it, and like they treat like some of like the conservis people treat it like the birthday card industry. Like it's just sort of like, what year were you born? And like they've got like conservis for that. It's crazy.
Yeah, Tom, I mean, Tom, that's a really cool point, and not to go on too long about this, but like there are vintage conservas. You know, like people trade in these where you'll get sardines that are maybe, the best by date is, 2010, but the can itself is really from vintage 1990, or something like that, right? Like, and people trade in these. Some of these things actually are considered to get a lot better as they age. That doesn't go for all canned fish, but especially with sardines. And then, in terms of the pairings, it's really a little bit about bringing European culture over here. Like America, we love cheese, chocolate's very popular here. Canned fish is not. And so with this canned fish tasting, we're going to be doing vermouth on both tastings probably, and then there'll be like a vermouth and then a wine that's not vermouth. I think the first one is going to be a Bass Chicoli, so kind of like a high acidity, lower alcohol white, just a tiny bit effervescent. Should go very well with the fish. And here we think of vermouth most of the time as like it's a mixer. We don't drink it on the rocks. But if you go to Spain and you're eating tapas, you go in and they've got vermouth on taps, and you can pick from 4 or 5 of them, and you can have vermouth with a couple rocks and an orange peel, or you can have vermouth with this or that. It's a really different drink when you just drink it on ice and have it with some superb canned fish. So we're trying to recreate a little bit of that culture here in Michigan.
So you can take a quick trip to Portugal and Spain with us next week, and then I believe a week after for the canned fish conserva round 2. But in the meantime, I want to take a moment to thank our special guest, Tom. This was so fun, and it was great to hang out with you. And I'm just so thankful that we could spend some time doing this. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And it was wonderful to share, what we do at Shelburne Farms and, obviously the cheeses that we make here. And, I really hope that I get to see you live and in person very soon, Zach.
Amen. And for all of you guys, it's become my sign off lately. If you guys keep showing up, we're going to keep doing what we do. We're so incredibly thankful for the opportunity to connect you with these producers and these passionate people. And we're just so thankful for all the support and love we've been getting. So thank you guys so much. We'll be on this chat for a little bit as we're breaking down, but that's the end of your scheduled programming. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful night. Thank you.